Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
Welcome back to the deep dive. If you're joining us, you already know what we do here. We take this mountain of global news,
It's a huge pile.
a huge pile, the science, the economics, the geopolitical friction, and we try to boil it all down. We cut through the noise.
The goal is to find those essential nuggets of knowledge. We're giving you the shortcut to being genuinely in the loop, but, without that feeling of being completely overwhelmed.
And today's deep dive feels monumental, doesn't it? It feels like we're at a real turning point.
I completely agree. On one hand, you have humanity literally reaching for the stars, talking about interstellar ambition. We're actually discussing how to, quote, rewire our own brains.
Which is just a wild concept.
It's a wild concept. And then at the very same moment, we are grappling with some of the deepest humanitarian crises and political fractures that we've seen in a decade. It's a real paradox.
So, to make sense of all this, we've broken it down into three main areas. First up, we're going to tackle what we're calling the new frontiers.
That's the really fast-paced stuff. The speed of discovery in deep space, new insights into the human brain, and some truly mind-blowing genetics.
Then from there, we'll pivot to the friction points. This is where things get tense. We're talking about the AI Cold War, global trade wars, and the incredible pressure on all our supply chains.
And finally, we'll ground it all in human reality. What does this all mean on the ground? We'll look at the immediate impacts of extreme climate, the hotspots in global conflict, and the push for political accountability at home.
This is a lot to get through.
It is, but the connections between these themes, that's where it gets really fascinating. So I think we should just jump right in. Let's start at the absolute outer limits of human ingenuity.
Let's do it. Section 1, the new frontiers. And where else to start but in space? The story up there right now is, well, it feels like it's being told in split screen.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
On one side of the screen, you have this incredible national pride, the big government missions.
Yeah.
But on the other, you have this burgeoning commercial reality that's just exploding.
And on that commercial side, you can't ignore Blue Origin. It feels like all eyes are on them as they get ready for the launch of the New Glenn rocket.
Oh, absolutely. And New Glenn isn't just another rocket. This thing is massive. The vehicle itself represents a huge leap in what commercial companies are capable of.
So what's its primary mission? What's the goal here?
It's specifically designed to expand our satellite deployment capabilities. You should think of it as reliable, heavy-lift access to orbit.
So we're not just talking about launching a few small experiments.
Not at all. This is about scaling up the actual infrastructure for the next generation of everything. Global communication, remote sensing, even in-orbit manufacturing.
It's a signal, then, that the commercial players are really moving into these mission-critical, large-scale space operations that were, until recently, totally dominated by governments.
That's exactly it. But that commercial ambition is being contrasted very sharply by the continued, and I would say rapid maturation of national programs.
You're talking about China here.
I am. China, for instance, just wrapped up another completely successful mission. They brought their astronauts, their taikonauts, safely back to Earth.
And their progress is it's relentless.
It is. It's remarkable not just for the complexity of the missions, but for the consistency. Their success in human spaceflight shows this really robust, reliable, and maturing capability.
It puts them on the same level as the U.S. and Russia.
Firmly alongside them. And that underscores this fundamental shift in the geopolitical balance of power that, extends far beyond Earth's atmosphere.
But this race to innovate, the speed, it comes with some very real, very volatile risks. We saw that in a pretty stark way with the explosion of that experimental other ATL spacecraft.
We did. And that failure, it brings up some really crucial questions about the trade-off between speed and safety.
How fast can you go before things start breaking?
Exactly. When you're rushing new propulsion systems or testing exotic materials, failures are not just possible, they're inevitable.
And that ATLS incident is a really harsh, very public reminder of that fact.
It is. Even as private investors are pouring billions and billions of dollars into this sector, you have to remember these are all cutting-edge technologies. They're operating under immense physical stress.
You need those rigorous safety protocols, but I imagine rapid innovation just constantly clashes with that kind of, bureaucratic caution.
It's a constant tension. Now, this is where our conversation can pivot a bit from these engineering challenges to some real cosmic mysteries.
I think I know where you're going with this. Let's talk about Moomua.
Let's. So this object, for anyone who needs a refresher, it's zipped through our solar system a few years ago, and it has always defied any easy explanation.
And now a Harvard astronomer is doubling down on an extremely provocative claim about it.
Extremely. The claim is that Oumuamua might be using thrusters to accelerate.
Which sounds like something straight out of science fiction. So what's the pushback? What's the conventional explanation?
Well, the scientific community is still very much divided. The more conventional and frankly more likely explanation is that the acceleration we saw is caused by something called natural outgassing.
Right. So as it gets closer to the sun, frozen stuff inside it turns to gas and shoots out like tiny little rockets.
Exactly. The volatiles inside turn into gas and vent out, and they act like these tiny randomized natural rockets pushing it along.
But the astronomer's argument is that the pattern of acceleration was just too weird. It wasn't random enough.
That's the core of his argument. He's saying it's so unique, so non-random, that it can't be easily explained away by outgassing alone.
So that anomaly forces scientists to really question our basic assumptions about how things move in space, regardless of what the object actually is.
It does, and this is where it gets really, truly mind-bending. Because if you discount the outgassing theory, the only remaining hypothesis for that kind of controlled acceleration is artificial manipulation. And from there, the speculation moves immediately to the possibility of it being an alien probe.
It's a huge leap, obviously.
It's a massive leap, and it's highly theoretical. But the discussion itself is valuable because it's forcing us to accept that our current understanding of physics might not account for everything we see out there.
So what if the physics isn't the problem? What if? What if we're the problem? That seems to be the logical bridge this astronomer is suggesting when he thinks about interstellar travel.
That's exactly it. The idea is that the ultimate barrier to reaching the stars might not be technology. It might be our own deep-seated evolutionary instincts.
Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. The hypothesis is that a long-duration, multi-generational trip between stars requires a level of risk tolerance, cooperation, and long-term planning that fundamentally conflicts with our human wiring.
So we're just not built for it.
We're not. We're wired for immediate threats, for fear of the unknown, and for creating these complex, often volatile, social hierarchies, none of which are great for a 1,000-year journey in a tin can.
So we might have the propulsion tech within reach, but the argument is that our minds are the real limiting factor.
Yes. And if we are ever going to commit to a centuries-long journey to another star system, this scientist suggests we might need a fundamental rewiring of the human brain.
Through something like neural augmentation.
Perhaps. Something to mitigate the immense psychological stresses and override those deeply ingrained, risk-averse instincts that keep us safe here on Earth.
It raises a pretty profound question, then.
It does. Can humanity survive the vacuum of deep space without first evolving beyond its own terrestrial tribalism?
That fear of the unknown that kept our ancestors safe on the savannah might be the very thing that keeps us trapped in our own solar system.
Precisely. Our greatest strength could become our ultimate limitation.
Okay, let's bring this idea of rewiring the brain down to a much more practical level, because the power of adaptation is already very evident in our lives.
It is. We have some really compelling research that shows simply learning a new language can significantly slow down the aging of your brain.
And no fancy neural augmentation required, just, good old-fashioned studying.
Exactly. And this is a tremendous finding for what we call cognitive longevity. When you learn a new language, you're constantly engaging these high-level executive functions, your memory, your attention.
It's like a workout for your brain.
Like a constant workout. This relentless mental stimulation forces the brain to adapt, and it enhances what scientists call neuroplasticity.
Which is the brain's ability to create new neural pathways, to basically reorganize itself.
That's right. And crucially, this activity builds something called cognitive reserve.
Okay, think of cognitive reserve like a buffer, right? The more complex and connected your brain is, the better it can handle age-related damage.
That's a perfect analogy. It helps the brain compensate for that damage, or even for the early stages of diseases like Alzheimer's. And what's really encouraging from the research is that these benefits appear even when you start learning as an adult.
So it's never too late to pick up a new language and invest in your brain health.
It's never too late. Now, switching gears a bit from practical brain health to something more like existential philosophy. Let's talk about the truly profound.
Uh-oh.
There's a radical scientific theory gaining some traction that posits human consciousness might not be generated by the brain at all.
Okay, so if it's not generated by the brain, where does it come from?
The theory suggests it originates from a higher dimension.
That sounds like we've crossed over from science into something else entirely.
It borders on it, for sure.
Yeah.
But the core scientific argument here challenges the purely materialist view of consciousness. The theory suggests the brain isn't the generator, but instead it acts as a filter.
Filter. Or like a receiver, like an antenna for consciousness.
Exactly like an antenna. It's interpreting information from this wider, multidimensional conscious landscape that exists independently of our physical bodies.
The implication for our sense of identity is it's huge. If our consciousness is transcendent, then the traditional boundaries of self and body just kind of blur.
They completely blur. This kind of theory often gets linked to quantum mechanics, and it posits a reality that's far richer than the three physical dimensions we're used to perceiving. Conventional science is, of course, very skeptical.
Of course.
But the idea itself pushes the limits of how we even define what reality is.
And we can actually find echoes of these kinds of transcendent states in observable neurological phenomena. You're talking about ecstatic epilepsy.
I am. It's the condition that was famously experienced by the writer Fyodor Dostoevsky.
And it serves as this fascinating bridge between the mystical and the material, the spiritual and the biological.
It does. These ecstatic seizures are linked to a specific brain region called the anterior insula. It's an area involved in processing our bodily states and our emotional awareness.
And people who experience this, they report an ecstatic aura. What does that feel like?
It's described as a subjective sensation of profound clarity, a feeling of universal understanding, and a sense of direct perception of reality, unfiltered.
So the anterior insula, a physical part of our brain, can neurologically create an experience that feels, for all intents and purposes, spiritual or mystical.
Which leads to the big question. Is the brain capable of generating these profound states all on its own? Or is it, as the other theory suggests, temporarily removing its own filter and allowing us a brief glimpse of that hypothesized higher dimension of consciousness?
We don't have an answer for that.
We do not. But moving from the esoteric back to the therapeutic, the pace of genetic breakthroughs right now is just breathtaking.
Absolutely. We have a groundbreaking development involving CRISPR, the gene editing technology. It was used to revive an ancient non-functional gene in human liver cells.
And what's interesting here is that this is less about making humans better and more about fixing a kind of historical evolutionary glitch.
A glitch.
Yes. Humans, at some point deep in our evolutionary past, lost the ability to produce an enzyme called uricase.
And the job of that enzyme is really crucial. It breaks down uric acid in the body.
It does. So when we lost that gene function, uric acid began to accumulate in our bodies, leading to a condition called hyperuricemia.
Which, to be clear for everyone listening, is just a fancy way of saying you have high levels of uric acid in your blood.
That's all it is. And that uric acid precipitates into these incredibly painful crystals. That's what gout is. And it also significantly contributes to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which has become a massive global public health crisis.
So by using CRISPR to reactivate that old uricase enzyme in the lab, scientists are targeting the root cause of the problem.
Exactly. Instead of just managing the symptoms of gout with medication, they're aiming to correct the underlying metabolic imbalance. It offers a potential functional cure for both gout and fatty liver disease.
This whole theme of metabolic correction seems to be a big trend. There's also a major breakthrough in diabetes research.
A huge one. Diabetes currently accounts for, about 4.2 million deaths worldwide every year, mostly from its complications. Researchers have now discovered a small molecule that can interrupt a key harmful protein pair.
So this molecule essentially changes the whole treatment paradigm.
It completely shifts it. Instead of focusing only on regulating blood sugar, which is still essential, don't get me wrong, this molecule actively blocks the diabetic inflammation and tissue damage that happens over the long term.
It's targeting the underlying engine of all the complications then. The damage to the kidneys, the cardiovascular system, the nerves.
That's right. And the ability to block that inflammation directly holds immense promise. It could lead to faster wound healing and drastically reduce the severe long-term complications that make the disease so debilitating or fatal. It's a shift from just maintenance to active damage prevention.
And we also have some extremely positive news in kidney health, specifically around acute kidney injury, or AKI.
which is often lethal. Scientists have successfully reversed AKI, at least in mouse models.
How did they manage that?
They did it by targeting something called ceramide metabolism. Ceramides are a type of fatty molecule. When ceramide levels surge in the kidney during an injury, they interfere with the mitochondria.
The powerhouses of the cells.
Exactly. And that causes cellular shutdown and eventually organ failure. By modulating the production of those ceramides, they were able to effectively block that cascade of kidney damage.
So this research offers some real hope for developing new interventions for humans.
Immense hope. If we can target ceramide metabolism in people, we might be able to develop drugs or even early biomarkers to prevent this condition, which is so often deadly.
Okay, now let's circle back to that slightly unsettling piece of news we touched on earlier. The discovery deep inside the lungs of every single living person.
Right. Scientists made what they called a surprising and concerning discovery. It's a substance or a structure that they did not expect to find deep in our pulmonary systems.
The specific details are still under wraps, right? They're still being analyzed.
They are. But the initial reaction from the scientific community is one of immediate concern.
And what's crucial to understand here is the implication of finding a fundamental unknown within our core biology.
That's the key. If something is present in every human lung, and we are only just discovering it now in the 21st century, it means there's a critical blind spot in our public health paradigms, in our understanding of respiratory diseases.
So what could it be? A persistent microplastic, some unique cellular structure we just never saw before.
We don't know yet, but the mystery itself emphasizes that even as we're looking outward to the stars, we're still discovering these fundamental unknowns right inside our own bodies.
A mysterious object in interstellar space, possibly using thrusters, and a mysterious substance in all our lungs. The universe, both external and internal, is really baffling us right now.
Is indeed.
All right, let's shift our gaze from the biological frontiers to the technological battlegrounds that are defining the new global order.
Let's do it. And that means we have to talk about AI.
The battle for AI dominance is now pretty widely being called the AI Cold War, and that tension between the U.S. and China is just palpable.
It is. And a central debate right now is about development methodology. Is it open source or is it proprietary control?
Right. And the co-founder of Databricks, Andy Kaminsky, is making a very strong and I think strategically important argument here.
His point is that the U.S. have to embrace open source AI development. He argues that these proprietary models, the ones locked away inside large American tech silos, actually limit the speed and the breadth of innovation across the entire ecosystem.
And that's critical because China is taking the opposite approach and capitalizing on it.
Completely. China is aggressively leveraging collaboration and open source methods, often with the backing of state capital. And as a result, we're seeing these systems emerge, like DeepSeek, developed by Chinese firms, that are already outperforming U.S. models in specific benchmarks.
So the Cold War framing is really appropriate here. The stakes aren't just commercial.
No, they're military and they're geopolitical. Kaminsky's argument is that open sourcing is essential for democratizing access to this cutting-edge AI. It allows researchers and startups all across the U.S. to rapidly build, improve, and iterate.
Preventing China from getting an irreversible technological lead.
That's the strategic goal. Now, what's really interesting is when we look at AI adoption, who is actually using these tools, the United States isn't even the global leader.
I saw this. Data from the 2024 Digital Consumer Insights report shows that Latin America is actually setting the pace.
It's a truly surprising nugget of knowledge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Brazil leads the pack with 76% of its population using AI tools. Mexico is not far behind at 70%. The U.S. rate is only 52%.
So what does that tell us?
It tells us that this rapid proliferation in emerging markets means AI isn't just a toy for Silicon Valley. It's immediately integrated technology for solving local problems and enhancing digital life, and it's often bypassing the regulatory friction that we see in more advanced economies.
Now, let's look inside the corporate giants that are driving this whole thing. Leaked documents have given us a much clearer view of the deep, and I mean intricate, financial architecture of the OpenAI and Microsoft partnership.
Right. The leaked details confirm that OpenAI shares approximately 20% of its revenue directly with Microsoft.
And this isn't just a friendly collaboration.
Not at all.
Yeah.
This is a strategic alliance where Microsoft provided over $13 billion in investment, largely in the form of the crucial Azure cloud computing infrastructure that you need to train and run these massive models like ChatGPT.
And with OpenAI's valuation just skyrocketing to $500 billion after a recent share sale, that 20% stake is monumental.
It is. But the documents also raise some serious questions about the true underlying profitability of OpenAI.
Because running these models is incredibly expensive.
It's immensely resource-intensive,
Yeah.
which suggests that Microsoft is essentially subsidizing the AI arms race to secure its own strategic dominance in the cloud market.
Which leads us directly to the human cost of all this acceleration. The rapid adoption of AI and automation is correlating directly with massive layoffs across the tech sector.
Over 112,000 employees were laid off in just the first half of this year.
It really is the ultimate paradox of technological progress, isn't it? We're creating these hyper-intelligent systems that can solve huge problems, but that very capability is making a massive number of human jobs redundant.
It is. And the challenge for policymakers everywhere is figuring out how to balance this drive for efficiency with the absolute necessity of human employment and social stability.
And the geopolitical heat that we're seeing in the AI sector is just as intense, if not more so, in foundational manufacturing, especially in semiconductors.
Oh, absolutely. Right now, we're seeing what can only be described as a full-blown civil war erupting at Nexperia.
That's the Chinese-owned Dutch chipmaker.
That's the one. And this conflict just exploded into public view after the Dutch economy minister, Vincent Keijermans, acted to enforce a new law. A law specifically designed to legally separate the European arm of the company from its Chinese parent company.
And Beijing did not take that well.
Beijing reacted with outrage, condemning the move as reckless political interference. This whole incident is a perfect illustration of how global supply chains are being weaponized.
The U.S. has been putting pressure on the Netherlands for years to cut China out of its high-tech chip manufacturing.
Continuous pressure. And the Dutch courts had already removed the Chinese management because of internal governance issues. Nexperia has basically become a proxy battleground, and it just highlights the intense volatility in the global semiconductor supply chain.
We're seeing a clear trend of decoupling in the auto sector as well.
We are. Tesla, for instance, just instituted a brand new policy. It requires its suppliers to avoid using any made-in-China parts for vehicles that are sold in the United States.
And that aligns with what we're seeing from General Motors and other big automakers.
It's a direct response to the escalating geopolitical trade tensions. It's pushing manufacturers to bolster their domestic production, or at least production in allied countries, even if it adds complexity or raises costs in the short term.
It's a shift from pure cost efficiency to a focus on national security and supply chain resilience.
Exactly. And now, shifting to the consumer side of things, global e-commerce platforms are facing major scrutiny over in Europe. French authorities have flagged massive platforms like Temu and AliExpress.
For allegedly selling illicit products, right?
That's right. And this whole regulatory push was really spurred on by that preceding, very high-profile scandal involving Shein.
So authorities are finally recognizing that while cross-border e-commerce is convenient, it requires much stricter oversight to make sure that the products being imported comply with local safety, legal, and environmental standards.
The ease of global purchasing has to be matched by robust consumer protection. It's as simple as that.
All right, let's look at trade policy in the U.S., where President Trump executed a major strategic reversal recently.
He did. He signed an executive order that rolled back tariffs on dozens of food products. We're talking staples like beef, coffee, and bananas.
And this move is fascinating because it involves reversing a trade protectionist stance that the administration had previously really favored. The motivation, though, seems pretty clear.
Oh, it's very clear. Combating rising consumer inflation. Tariffs are intended to protect domestic industries, but they often just increase the cost of imports.
Which then gets passed directly on to the consumer at the checkout counter.
Exactly. So from the perspective of inflation control and consumer relief, this move is being hailed as a necessary correction. It's acknowledging the financial strain that high grocery prices put on households.
Right, because economists have argued for a long time that tariffs basically just act as a consumption tax, and they disproportionately hit lower-income families.
That's the argument. Conversely, you have the skeptical perspective,
Of course.
which suggests that this is a politically motivated move, timed perfectly ahead of the elections. Critics are questioning the long-term commitment to free trade principles.
So the concern is that the administration might just reinstate all these tariffs after the election is over.
That's the worry. And it creates instability and uncertainty for importers and exporters alike.
And to further address food price pressure, the White House has also been busy securing some new trade deals with key South American nations.
That's right, including Ecuador, Argentina, Guatemala, and El Salvador. These agreements are specifically aimed at cutting tariffs on key agricultural imports.
So the goal is to flood the U.S. market with cheaper foreign products to force down consumer food prices here through increased competition.
That's the strategy. You know, when we connect these trade policy dynamics back to that theme of evolutionary instinct and tribalism we talked about, tariffs and protectionism often embody that instinct, don't they? That instinct for immediate resource hoarding.
We protect our industries and our
And
resources.
even if the long-term rational analysis suggests that free trade is actually more economically efficient for the species as a whole.
And that concept of resource hoarding brings us to the absolutely staggering wealth disparity that's been highlighted in some recent reports. The contrast between the global elites and the world's most vulnerable it's just stark.
It truly is. We're seeing projections that indicate Elon Musk is on track to become the world's first trillionaire. That figure is so vast it surpasses the gross domestic product of 170 entire nations.
It's a number that's hard to even comprehend. And at the same time, close to 700 million people around the globe are living on less than $2.15 a day.
And an Oxfam report really emphasized the source of this massive accumulation. The wealthiest 10% of people own over 85% of the world's riches. And that wealth often comes from inherited advantage and monopoly power, not just sheer talent or innovation.
This extraordinary concentration of wealth is being cited as a major driver of social unrest and instability all over the world.
And we see this instability playing out even within powerful alliances like the European Union. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has just vowed to sue the EU over its decision to phase out Russian gas imports by 2028.
And Orban is arguing that the decision, which relies on something called a qualified majority vote,
Meaning it passed with enough votes, but it wasn't unanimous.
right. He argues that this was unlawful and that it threatens Hungary's fundamental energy security and economic stability.
And this is a critical legal challenge. It really tests the limits of the EU's collective decision-making power versus the national sovereignty of its member states on these crucial energy matters.
All right, we've spent a lot of time looking at the absolute heights of human scientific ambition. I think now we have to turn to the low points, the immediate conflicts and human suffering that persist despite all our progress.
We do. And the compounding crisis in the Middle East, specifically in Gaza and the West Bank, just continues to deteriorate. It's defined by trauma and immediate physical danger. Health officials in Gaza recently reported the return of 15 Palestinian bodies by Israel, which just underscores the deep toll of this conflict.
And the displaced population there is facing environmental disasters on top of the conflict itself.
Severe flooding is inundating the makeshift shelters, which increases the risk of disease as winter weather sets in. And critically, children are being exposed to the physical danger of unexploded ordnance landmines, remnants of rockets, while they're just trying to gather basic necessities like firewood.
And the psychological damage must be just devastating.
It is. UN reports confirm that over 90% of children in Gaza are now exhibiting aggressive behaviors. This is a direct consequence of prolonged exposure to conflict, violence, and profound instability over the last 2 years. This is a mental health catastrophe in the making.
And meanwhile, in the West Bank, the violence has escalated dramatically.
It has. A UN report confirmed that settler attacks against Palestinians have reached their highest level since 2006, leading to increased tensions and casualties. And this violence, it doesn't just victimize Palestinians, it also creates these deepening fissures within Israeli society itself over security policy and civil order.
It just makes any path toward a peaceful resolution even more distant.
Much more distant. Now, shifting to Africa, the human rights situation in Sudan is horrific. Following the takeover of El Fasher by the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, the UN Rights Council has ordered a full probe into reports of atrocities.
And the evidence coming out of El Fasher is just grim.
It's grim. It includes reports that the RSF is burning bodies to conceal mass graves. This conflict has fueled the largest displacement crisis globally. Over 12 million people have been displaced. That's a figure that should shock every single listener. The scale of this suffering often gets lost in our fragmented global news cycle.
And all of these crises are being made worse by a massive global aid shortage.
That's right. UN agencies are urgently warning that humanitarian funding is currently only at about 1/3 of the estimated $29 billion that's required worldwide.
So what does that mean in practical terms?
It forces organizations like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR and the World Food Program, the WFP, into what they're calling ruthless prioritization.
I have to choose who to help.
They have to choose who gets to eat. Essential aid is being cut just as winter is approaching, and it's impacting millions of refugees. And this is partly due to decreased funding commitments from major governments, including the United States.
Amid all this chaos, there are some small efforts at peace. We saw a rare positive development in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the DRC.
We did. A framework peace deal was signed in Qatar between the government and the Rwandan-backed M23 rebel group.
Facilitated by the U.S. and Qatar, I believe?
That's right. And this initiative includes 8 implementation protocols. It covers crucial steps like monitoring the ceasefire and exchanging prisoners. The urgent goal here is to just begin to improve the dire humanitarian situation and restore some measure of state authority to stabilize those eastern provinces.
And the Abyei region, which is disputed between Sudan and South Sudan, remains a very complex flashpoint. The UN Security Council just extended its peacekeeping mission there for another year.
And the vote was nearly unanimous, 12-0. But the abstentions are what's telling. Russia, China, and Pakistan all abstain.
What does that signal?
It signals the deep-seated regional political complexities and the disagreements surrounding the UN's role in maintaining stability in this historically contested area.
Okay, let's move to Eastern Europe. The dynamics of military aid for Ukraine are shifting. We're seeing a really strong commitment from the Nordic and Baltic NATO members.
We are. They just announced a new $430 million military aid package.
And this package is crucial, but the geopolitical conversation around it is being framed by President Trump's consistent criticism that European nations need to shoulder a greater financial responsibility.
He's cited the large U.S. expenditures in the past and is demanding that European NATO members contribute more significantly to the defense budget.
This whole aid debate is also being complicated by internal factors in Kyiv.
It is. Ukraine is battling an ongoing corruption scandal. There were high-profile embezzlement charges recently brought against President Zelensky's former business partner in the energy sector.
And corruption remains a critical obstacle.
A huge one. The scandal complicates the delivery of Western aid, and it increases pressure from the European Union, which is demanding verifiable action to ensure that the funds and military equipment being supplied are not misappropriated.
And on the diplomatic front, Vice President J.D. Vance recently defended President Trump's decision to resume direct negotiations with Russian President Vladimir Putin following that summit in Alaska.
Right, and Vance framed this approach as the Trump doctrine, advocating for a combination of military strength alongside a pragmatic willingness to engage in dialogue.
And this stance is being maintained despite some pretty strong criticism from some European allies who believe that isolating Moscow is the better strategy.
That's right. Now, let's talk about a fascinating piece of political analysis regarding the Russian opposition. The article highlighted a paradox.
A paradox?
Yes. Many figures in Russia's liberal opposition, the ones who are advocating for democratic reform at home, frequently adopt a fiercely anti-Palestinian stance.
That's interesting. So the analysis points to a kind of moral blind spot.
It does,
Yeah.
by sometimes employing dehumanizing language toward Palestinians and showing this uncritical allegiance to one side of that conflict. These liberal figures are essentially adopting a selective moral vision.
They're undermining their own claims to having the ethical high ground over the authoritarianism they're fighting in Moscow.
Exactly. It just highlights how easily political causes can be separated from universal human rights principles.
Finally, in the volatile region of Indian-administered Kashmir, we saw the horrific consequence of ongoing security operations with that accidental explosion at the Naugam police station.
A true tragedy. It killed 9 people, mostly police officers and forensic officials. And it happened while they were inspecting a massive cache of confiscated explosives
Specifically, 360 kilograms of ammonium nitrate.
that they had seized from a suspected terror module. The sheer force of that blast, which was captured on CCTV shaking buildings far away, just underscores the extreme volatility and the danger that security forces face in that region every single day.
Okay, shifting to Asia, the tensions over Taiwan remain a major flashpoint in U.S.-China relations. The Pentagon just approved the current administration's first arms sale to Taiwan.
That's right, $330 million worth of spare parts for their U.S.-made aircraft.
Taiwan, naturally, welcomed the move. They see it as a crucial reinforcement of their security partnership.
Yeah.
Beijing, however,
Beijing condemned it immediately. They stated that these arms sales infringe upon their sovereignty and constitute a crucial red line in the bilateral relationship.
and the friction isn't just military. China is leveraging soft power diplomatically.
They are. Both China and Hong Kong have issued travel advisories warning their citizens against visiting Japan. They're citing an alleged rise in attacks that have been targeting Chinese citizens since mid-2025.
And this travel warning is a really powerful non-military diplomatic tool.
It is. It's designed to exert economic and social pressure on Japan. And it clearly connects these safety concerns to the growing Taiwan row and the broader bilateral diplomatic friction between Beijing and Tokyo.
And finally, diplomatic efforts in Southeast Asia show just how quickly peace can collapse. President Trump had to call Thailand and Cambodia after renewed clashes completely upended a ceasefire he had brokered just a few weeks prior.
Yeah, that truce, which was intended to resolve these long-standing border disputes, was suspended after a landmine explosion, escalated tensions, and renewed accusations of violence from both sides.
It just highlights the profound fragility of these diplomatic agreements when there are deep-rooted historical conflicts involved.
It really does.
Let's bring this discussion back to domestic accountability, where the long shadow of the Jeffrey Epstein investigation continues to generate political chaos.
The recent news cycle was completely dominated by President Trump's public demand that the Justice Department, the DOJ, investigate former President Bill Clinton's ties to Jeffrey Epstein.
And this demand came just as scrutiny over Trump's own past associations with Epstein was intensifying.
Exactly. Trump framed the renewed focus on his own connections as a Democratic hoax, claiming it was all political deflection. But the complexity of Epstein's network is just undeniable.
And the DOJ is now officially investigating alleged ties between Epstein, Bill Clinton, and various financial institutions and other high-profile figures.
This is a textbook example of a political maneuver. On one hand, the involvement of Bill Clinton and other elites absolutely necessitates a thorough inquiry for the sake of justice and for the survivors.
But on the other hand,
Democrats are rightfully accusing President Trump of leveraging the DOJ to settle political scores and to deflect scrutiny from his own circles. And that raises serious concerns about the integrity and the impartiality of federal resources, especially in an election year.
So the key impartial takeaway here should be that the goal is full accountability, regardless of anyone's party affiliation.
It has to be. And the House vote that's expected soon to release further Epstein documents, which is being driven by survivors and accusers, is a necessary step toward transparency in this incredibly complex and politically charged mess.
All right, on the policy front, the Trump administration recently launched a highly targeted immigration operation. It's called Safe Return.
It is. And this operation resulted in the deportation of 230 immigrants, but it was significantly focused on removing 150 convicted sex offenders from Cuba, Venezuela, and Ukraine.
So this aligns perfectly with the administration's core enforcement strategy.
It does. The strategy prioritizes the removal of what they term criminal illegal aliens to enhance child safety and national security.
Conversely, the critics of this policy argue that this kind of high-profile operation serves to unnecessarily target and instill fear in immigrant communities, even among nonviolent individuals, amid these rising tensions over enforcement.
Their argument is that border policy needs to address the root causes of migration, not just use a purely punitive approach.
In the courts, we saw a critical check on executive power regarding universities. A federal judge indefinitely barred the Trump administration from fining the University of California, or UC, a massive $1.2 billion over allegations of anti-Semitism discrimination.
And the judge's ruling was based on the principle of academic freedom. They viewed the threat to withhold such a significant amount of funding as unlawful coercion,
arguing that the executive branch can't unilaterally use financial threats to dictate internal university policy.
Exactly. It affirms the judiciary's role in moderating executive actions when it comes to higher education.
We also saw a measure of accountability within the highest levels of federal finance. The former Federal Reserve Governor, Adriana Kugler, resigned following an ethics probe.
That probe revealed she had engaged in improper stock trades, violating internal trading rules that are designed to prevent conflicts of interest.
And this incident really underscores the ongoing necessity for strict ethical oversight and compliance at the highest levels of our federal financial institutions, where insider information can have massive implications for the market.
It really does. And finally, at the local political level, the push for redistricting in Indiana is expected to collapse.
And this is a setback for the administration's strategy of countering a potential Republican majority in the House by maximizing electoral advantage in key states.
That's right. Local political resistance and maneuvering appear to have rendered that national initiative ineffective, which just demonstrates the limitations of a top-down political strategy.
All right, across the pond, the UK political landscape is being characterized by this constant, almost self-parodying internal friction,
Which ministers themselves are calling self-inflicted chaos.
self-inflicted chaos, and this chaos is happening on two fronts.
It is. First, we saw an independent member of parliament, an MP, resigned from Jeremy Corbyn's new left-wing party, citing what she called a troubling toxic culture.
And second,
There's growing frustration among ministers who are publicly fuming that the constant self-inflicted mistakes and missteps coming from No 10, the Prime Minister's residence, are fundamentally distracting them from critical, substantive policy work.
and the policy shifts they are making are equally contentious. The UK government is moving to significantly restrict asylum seekers to temporary stays.
Which effectively abandons their previous commitments to granting permanent protection. The government claims this is necessary for capacity and management.
While critics argue it severely undermines the UK's humanitarian principles and its international commitments.
Exactly. And the legislative process is also just bogged down by these ethical debates. The assisted dying bill in the House of Lords is facing a massive legislative bottleneck.
With over 900 proposed amendments.
Over 900. And this high volume just reflects the immense emotional, moral, and ethical stakes that are involved in legislating end-of-life choices.
Looking globally at democracy, we saw a rare commitment to transparency in Tanzania. President Samia Suluhu Hassan has committed to an inquiry into the electoral violence that marred their recent elections.
She did. And this commitment was prompted after the African Union specifically labeled that election as violating democratic principles. The UN estimates that there were hundreds of fatalities.
So it's a crucial step toward accountability, even if it's only happening under immense international pressure.
It is. Meanwhile, a crackdown on dissent in Tunisia under President Kais Saied continues. A jailed opposition figure, Jawhar Ben Mubarak, was just hospitalized after a 17-day hunger strike protesting his detention.
His health deteriorated rapidly, and this hospitalization really highlights the severe consequences that political opponents are facing under the current authoritarian consolidation of power in that country.
It underscores the very high-stakes nature of political dissent in Tunisia right now.
All right, our final section. Let's touch on the immediate realities of environmental instability, public safety, and some interesting cultural shifts.
Let's do it. We've seen widespread climate volatility recently. The UK was just hammered by Storm Claudia, which delivered a month's worth of rain in a single day across vast regions,
Causing severe flooding. And the immediate aftermath is this rapid swing. Forecasters are now predicting a swift shift to freezing temperatures and possible snow.
which just underscores the extreme, non-linear variability in modern weather patterns. The speed of that shift demands entirely new kinds of infrastructure resilience planning.
And internationally, we saw the tragic consequences of extreme weather in Portugal. An 85-year-old British woman died at a campsite in the Algarve due to extreme storm winds.
It just demonstrates the fragility of human life, even in environments we think of as normally safe.
We also had a major non-weather-related disaster near Buenos Aires in Argentina. A massive industrial explosion occurred at warehouses storing agricultural chemicals.
It injured 22 people. And this event raises serious alarm bells about industrial safety regulations, particularly when you have hazardous materials being stored near densely populated areas.
And the U.S. West Coast is bracing for its own severe weather from what meteorologists are calling an atmospheric river.
Which is essentially a concentrated channel of moisture that gets pulled from the Pacific. It significantly increases the risk of flash flooding and destructive mudslides.
Amid all these climate challenges, the world is looking for sustainable solutions. The UN Climate Change Conference, COP30, held in Belém, Brazil, achieved a crucial milestone.
It did. They included energy transition minerals in the draft text for the very first time.
And this signals a critical recognition that the massive global demand for minerals that we need for clean energy technologies like lithium for batteries, cobalt, has to be addressed ethically.
It does. Developing nations, particularly in Africa, are strongly demanding that the human rights risks and the environmental damage associated with mining be mitigated. And they want to receive tangible economic benefits from their own reserves.
The public frustration with the slow pace of these negotiations was also visible.
It was. Thousands of climate activists and indigenous people gathered for the Great People's March at COP30, demanding urgent action, reparations for climate damage, and robust commitments.
But we are also seeing some interesting local adaptations.
We are. East Timor is implementing these imaginative methods to combat climate change, focusing on sustainable agriculture and reforestation. And in Brazil, a traditional buffalo patrol on Marau Island was even showcased as a unique, culturally integrated, sustainable transport method.
And finally, the debate over our energy future remains intense. Bavarian Premier Markus Söder is calling for a nuclear comeback in Germany.
He's proposing the construction of small, mini reactors to enhance their energy security, just 2 years after the country shut down its last full-sized reactors.
And that push for future energy contrasts so sharply with the past.
It does. On the very day he made that proposal, 21,000 residents were evacuated in Nuremberg, Germany, to defuse an unexploded World War II bomb. It's such a powerful visual contrast, isn't it? The lingering shadows of past conflicts and the urgency of securing our future power.
All right, let's look at two critical aspects of global crime and security. We have to start with that accidental explosion in Kashmir that tragically killed 9 police and forensic officials while they were handling confiscated explosives.
It's just a devastating reminder of the extreme volatility that is inherent in counterterrorism operations. And the sheer quantity of explosives, 360 kilograms of ammonium nitrate, it really underscores the sophistication of the terror networks that are operating in that region.
We also saw targeted violence against those who were fighting organized crime, the tragic shooting of Mehdi Kassachi in Marseille.
He was the brother of a prominent French anti-drug activist, Amin Kassasi, and the shooting is strongly suspected to be a calculated act of intimidation linked to powerful drug networks.
This type of violence is aimed at silencing civil society and activists who dare to confront organized crime.
It is. It highlights the perilous environment that's faced by those fighting corruption and drug trafficking.
On a different scale, the global trafficking of cultural property has reached a massive scale. It's rivaling the arms and drug markets. Interpol recently seized over 37,000 cultural artifacts in a coordinated international operation.
And the scope is just astonishing. It involves everything from large-scale looting of Roman coins in Spain to be sold on social media, all the way up to the high-profile theft of 8 priceless items from the Louvre in Paris back in October of 2025.
And this illicit trade is deeply entwined with money laundering and the financing of criminal groups.
It is. The response now involves new technology. Agencies like the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the UNODC and UNESCO are mobilizing. They're using digital registries and even blockchain technology to track the provenance of these artifacts.
Trying to give these cultural treasures a digital fingerprint that criminals can't erase.
That's the idea. Now let's wrap up with some critical health and societal trends, beginning with 2 alarming viral threats.
Okay.
Ethiopia has reported its first outbreak of the Marburg virus. It's a cousin of Ebola. There are 8 confirmed cases, and there's no effective vaccine currently available.
And in the U.S., we've just had the first reported human case of a new variant of the H5N1 bird flu.
Both of these situations underscore the necessity for sustained global vigilance and preparedness against these zoonotic diseases, the ones that can jump from animals to humans.
We also have new dietary warnings that are hitting the younger demographic.
We do. Studies are now linking high consumption of ultra-processed foods, things like hot dogs, commercial breads, sweet treats, to a significantly increased risk of precancerous polyps and early-onset colorectal cancer, particularly in young women.
And this is a critical finding because colorectal cancer rates are rising fastest in younger adults.
It really emphasizes the urgent public health need to reduce our reliance on the convenience of processed foods and to shift our dietary patterns.
Here is a fascinating convergence of media and health. A study revealed that the popular TV series The White Lotuses sparked a significant surge in online searches for risky anxiety pills.
Which just illustrates the profound and often unintended influence that media narratives have on public health behavior. Fictional portrayals of characters self-medicating or using certain substances can drive viewers toward those same self-medication trends.
It highlights the need for some media accountability and how they depict mental health issues.
It does. Now, on a more personal, societal level, we have to acknowledge the pervasive issue of ableism. A person in a wheelchair recently recounted being mocked by strangers who were using the tongue-out TikTok trend as a form of ridicule.
And the author highlighted the failure of any bystanders to intervene. It just underscores the daily realities of discrimination that are faced by the disabled community.
It really emphasizes the crucial societal need for active allyship and intervention to combat this pervasive ableism.
And finally, we're seeing a shift in vulnerability and communication, especially in dating. A health advocate with endometriosis shared this incredibly vulnerable anecdote that her third date with her partner was at a fertility clinic.
Which highlights this growing movement toward a kind of radical honesty in modern relationships.
Yeah.
Conditions like endometriosis impact fertility and emotional dynamics.
And sharing these unsexy details up front is becoming vital for establishing genuine intimacy and finding a supportive partner who understands the reality of living with chronic health issues.
It's a real shift.
So when we pull all the way back and we try to synthesize this entire deep dive, we're left with this powerful, almost contradictory narrative about the state of our species.
It really is a contradiction. On one hand, we are witnessing this unprecedented technological and scientific progress. CRISPR is correcting evolutionary flaws, new breakthroughs are combating lethal diseases like AKI and diabetes, and we are philosophically contemplating our destiny among the stars.
Human potential is soaring to heights that were previously unimaginable.
And yet, on the other hand, we are failing profoundly at basic human stability. We see the psychological devastation of children in Gaza, the mass atrocities in Sudan, and that geopolitical instinct for tribal resource hoarding reflected in trade wars and supply chain fractures.
We have to reconcile this contradiction somehow.
We do. We raised that scientific hypothesis earlier that our deeply embedded evolutionary instincts, our fear, our tribalism, are fundamentally holding us back from achieving our long-term interstellar goals. If we accept that premise, and given the scientific capacity we now possess to rewire or augment the human brain, we face a critical choice about our species' adaptation.
So do we prioritize the urgent task of rewiring our instincts for conflict resolution, pouring our energy into adapting our minds to overcome the deep-seated conflicts that threaten basic human rights right here on Earth?
Or do we focus our scientific genius on cognitive health and exploration, aimed at ensuring our interstellar destiny and our long-term longevity as a species?
It raises a really important question for you, the learner.
If our species could only undergo one fundamental adaptation tomorrow, the one that solves conflict, or the one that enables interstellar ambition, which adaptation is the most urgently required for the long-term survival and flourishing of the human species?
A profound point to reflect on as you navigate the complexities of this world. We appreciate you joining us for this crucial deep dive.
Until next time.
For enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.